Now, your favorite music apps are available on Contour. Go from watching a musical to listening to your favorite music. Enjoy a country western and then a country jam. Or go from action flicks to something that makes you feel like an action hero. Now with Contour from Cox.
Eyes wide open. Compassionate Conspiracy. With your hosts, Dr. Hans Utter and Kathy Dyer. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another dynamic, thrilling, mesmerizing, and intoxicating edition of Eyes Wide Open. How are you doing today, Kathy?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I always, one of those things, how are you? I always kind of contemplate how to respond to that because it's...
I don't really mean it. I was just saying it to be nice.
I know you don't care about me, do you? You don't care. That's mean. You're a mean person, Kathy.
Oh, I'm not nice.
No, you are nice.
My social credit's going to be in the toilet. Don't say that.
You're relatively nice. I don't know. I've actually never met you in person. So,
I know.
So who knows? I did have a dream. I was trying to find your house because you didn't show up on time for the recording the broadcast, and I couldn't get into the community, and I was chased like a illegal alien trying to scale the walls to get you to record on time. It's kind of a funny dream. A little bit of cybernetics there for you. But so we're just going to go ahead and continue our foray into the extremely interesting and I would say relatively overlooked area of cybernetics. One of the things about cybernetics that's so important is not only is it the foundational ideology for transhumanism, but also transgenderism, and also serves as a model for different types of social agitation. For example, colored revolutions, the current dismal state of academic life with all these types of student protests about real non-issues that are made into issues, right? So you have, it's one thing if you're protesting against war in Vietnam. It's another thing if you're just protesting against some kind of gender issue or some type of privilege that is so bad, but yet this whole institution was created through this quote unquote privilege. And then again, we have one of these words, privilege. What do you even mean by that? Are you talking about hegemony? What do you mean by being privileged, right? It's one of these nonsensical types of cybernetic words, right?
And I think this is one of the themes that we're really delving into is there are double meanings of words. So, for example, I was sharing with you that I came across a paper on cybernetic limericks. And in it, the author was saying, one of the people that participated in cybernetics, Ashby, said a constraint was anything that reduced the variety a constraint was anything that reduced the variety possible or imaginable to the variety actually observed. A scientific law would be an example of a constraint. However, for many people, the term constraint carries a different connotation of confinement, restriction, or even manipulation. Some people have difficulty reading Ashby because of the slightly different meanings he sometimes gives to words. That's kind of important, don't you think?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, some people, I love how it's always some people, usually social scientists, feel that an idea, oops, I have to flip the page, in order to be important, must be counterintuitive. Well, that's kind of an interesting thing to be aware of if you're studying, to know that words can have different meanings and that information is counterintuitive, right? So how do we know that what we think we're taking in, the information, is actually what we're taking in? And it connects to what Warren McCullough would speak about, how information is power. but it's really the comprehension of the information is where the power is.
Absolutely. And the constraints, right? When you have an embedded idea like that, embedded meaning that it's taken root in your mind, it's taken root in your how you choose to see the world, it's going to influence you, right? If you even tacitly accept that, that means that not only is your intuition quote unquote wrong, but it can't even create ideas. They're not even ideas, right? There's this tautology there. They must be counterintuitive. So they're defining that basically intuition or these types of understanding are fundamentally baseless, incorrect, and are not even worthy of the category of ideas, right? You could have there's something like a bad idea, a stupid idea, a wonderful idea, right? You can qualify ideation, the ideational process. You can qualify and say this is if I decide to run naked through the street right now, that's probably a bad idea, but it's still an idea. But they're saying they're not even ideas, right? They're not even permitted within the domain of thought. And in case anyone thinks I'm kind of going over the top with pulling the stuff apart, I don't think I am, because when you start to look at this stuff in the broader context, you see that this is pretty pervasive within this whole cybernetics field. Is really holy writ coming from on high, even the sort of the way of kind of talking down to the children who are reading that and saying, okay, children, here's the way it is. And speaking
well, you
of,
see this level of condescension with these people, like when we talk about Bateson, or you're going to play part of a talk from Pongaro. When you hear them, you can get a sense that it's like a duper's delight. They know something that we don't. And we had talked before about sensory inhibition, which ties into the pre-Macy conferences of cerebral inhibition. And in a book you mentioned to me about sensory inhibition, they talk about the simplest way to get rid of information is to reduce the sensitivity of the receptors. So we don't even realize the power that they have through these technological systems, even a technological system being language, like neurolinguistic programming, because you can induce cerebral inhibition by the rate of your speech, the syllables you're using per word, your tone of voice. It's amazing, and yet we don't really even consider that.
Yeah, well, this idea, sensory inhibition, right? This is quite an interesting field, and there was a lot of very detailed research done on this subject, because there are certain types of stimuli that will mask or merge or make other types of experiences or stimuli imperceivable. So in a sense, they're really not happening, at least to the conscious mind. And in cerebral inhibition, right, that was another term for hypnosis, which was the original Macy Conference topic or theme, right? Well before it became the Macy Conferences, quote unquote, their first, during World War II, right? Their first meeting was about hypnosis and hypnotism, and also coming up with a better term for it. So if you see hypnosis as cerebral inhibition, I think you can start to parse out a little bit, get a little bit better idea about what they mean in these regards.
Yeah, and it comes into thinking, like, there's this thing going on the internet, Facebook right now, where there's a graph and it's got black dots and white dots, and they'll say who can see both at the same time, and we can't. And that's a really great example of masking. Another example of masking can be television, movies, and music that are sensory receptors, conscious sensory receptors can be, not say manipulated, but can be affected in ways that we're not aware of. And we could be taking information in. Now remember, we're taking the information in, and we might not be conscious of all of it, but it's still getting taken in. And what's the effect that it's having when we're not aware of what we're being exposed to, and it's still having an effect on us?
This is the state of hapless sort of unconsciousness, right? That sort of is one of the hallmarks of the modern contemporary world. And it's very evident when you examine the current media productions, the political debates, the nature of the entire system, how it's portrayed and why it's even accepted. I'll give you an example. I mean, there's several examples, and I'd like to pull up this article by this high court judge in England who sounds exactly, it's like he's reading directly from Mead's script about the family lifestyles of the future. The nuclear family is over. This oppressive thing is over. Now we're going to have all kinds of fluid boundaries and this and that. And this is in 2018. Now, she mentioned the stuff even in the mid 60s, but it is exact same range of talking points. And yet people, by and large, do not react or respond to these things anymore. They don't seem to, at least.
We live in a PTSD culture. We live in a traumatized culture. And the more painful things are in the world, the less capacity people have for understanding it. And the other thing that happens is they become so sensitized to pain that they really no longer even notice it. And I think this really comes into a society that, has been so shocked. We think about what happened with Kennedy, 9/11, Boston Marathon. I mean, there's an event that happens, every month or so, and it creates this trauma. And I think that trauma becomes, cumulative, and people can't digest it. And so they become more and more numb. And then they don't have a language around it. So the other thing that I think is really interesting is the language we're given, like when you said the word gender fluid, when you talked about privilege, these are words that are introduced into our culture. But words are not introduced to process through trauma. And then further, we're not allowed to talk about some of these things because they are not politically correct, or good people, nice people, don't talk about things like this. And I think that's a super important point that you just brought up.
Yeah. And now I'm trying to find this article that I found. This, of course, was from England, and I'm just getting 9 million results, and it's all about Trump separating families at the border, which is, what? And to be honest, well, guess what? If I go to India, I know people who've been thrown in jail because they overstayed their tourist visa, and they're literally locked up in jail. And I myself got stuck in India. I had to basically bribe some minister and stuff like that because luckily I was able to go to this club, gentleman's club, and meet people. And then I was able to go to, after spending weeks and thinking, crap, I'm going to be probably thrown in jail because I didn't get my visa go through properly. And once I met with the person, or I had the connections, I just walked in there and he's like, write this. My name is Hans. I like India very much. Please give me a residence permit. And then he gave the permit to me. Obviously, I had to slip him some money. But the fact was, hey, I could have been thrown in jail. And the fact is that there's a lot of places in the world that are relatively miserable to live in. And there's places that aren't. But the fact is that except for the West, every country in the world has border controls. Go ahead and try to go to Saudi Arabia. Go ahead, as I mentioned, even India. How many people per se want to go migrate to India from the West? Some do, right? But it's extremely difficult. And I probably mentioned this before, but Sonia Gandhi, who was married to the prime minister of India, it took her decades to get citizenship. And yet now we have this emotional engineering of, we're taking away the parents from the children, this and that. But guess what? Okay, this is slightly off topic, but if you look at what happened with the sort of forcing of Mexico to start taking types of grain imports and things like that, which was a type of financial blackmail where they basically crashed the peso. And I said, okay, guys, if you don't do this, here's what's going to happen. But by doing that, guess what? You suddenly displace all these people, and then people are not able to survive. And then you have this massive influx. And so you look at, these are processes, and, the cybernetic system while it may not be necessarily applicable, at least hopefully not applicable to the actual functioning of consciousness, even though they posit it, right? It is certainly very valuable and very efficacious in terms of creating different types of social engineering processes that have reaction and counter reaction. And I think also being able to manipulate them. So,
but those are like feedback loops. When you say reaction, counter reaction, ties back into circular feedback loops, right? That feed into one another and keep things going, but people aren't really aware of what they're doing. And so I think here's what happens is that people take things in a very linear way and in a very literal way. And what we're learning by the research that we've been doing on cybernetics is you can't make the assumption that you think you know what something means. You have to think a little bit more critically about it or make connections to how is what is happening now with this topic. So if we think about what you were talking about with Trump and sending children, back out of the country, and people now engaging in civil disobedience about it, and people getting arrested. This is just me. It looks so artificially constructed, and we're living in a world where that's legal under the NDAA and Smith-Mundt. They can legally do this, but people know that the Smith-Mundt Act exists, but in the same way, they never think that it's going to affect them, or that it's going to be what they're watching or hearing on the news right now. There's this big disconnect. And again, that kind of makes me think about what we were talking about before on when people are traumatized or there's a lot of shock and trauma in a society. What's the capacity of people to make sense from what's happening, and how do they connect the things that are happening to see the bigger picture? Or do they have the ability to?
Yeah. And this is the case, even though I got the different search terms, right? That's an example, right, where suddenly you cannot have a debate on factual matters, or you can, and you're suddenly qualified in a certain way. Right. And then we have these liberal this and that. Well, what happened to the whole liberal thing about economics? Right. Supposedly the whole point of the left or social movement was economic justice and things like that. Well, that's out the door. Now you have these manipulation of sort of altruism, emotional manipulation, right?
Absolutely.
And the fact is,
Absolutely.
guess what? Look at California. California is becoming a hellhole, right? Massive homelessness, prices to the roof. That was the sort of the pinnacle in a certain way of the quote unquote American dream of this golden state. And now look at California. It's being run totally into the ground. And yet you got people, again, you can't find housing, and yet there's housing being doled out to people who are breaking the law. Okay, now I'm sorry, your life in your country sucks. Well, why not change the trade laws? Why not do an intervention within these nations, especially our Mexico on the border, and so that life is not so unbearable there? And then, of course, with all these waves of migrants, you have things like MI6 and these gang members that are crossing the border 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, and they're murdering people and they're walking away. And so part of it.
Here's the thing: it's the system works with minds. As I listen to you speak, it's like what you're talking about is the way that we're designed to think about it, that the system's broken. But it's not broken, because if it was, it wouldn't be operating the way that it is. So again, it's a cybernetic view of the world that we think it's not working because we think it should be working in a different way. But it's working the way it's designed to work, in the same way that debt is handled in the United States. The United States is not as broke as people think it is, because there's so much money held in CAFR funds, but CAFR funds aren't considered to be part of the accounting. And so it's not even considered. So there's so many of these broken ways. There's so much cognitive dissonance embedded in the way that we think about ourselves in the world. And that's really what cybernetics does. It affects how do you think about yourself in the world? What do you think about the world?
Yeah. Well, let me read this article here, or parts of it this is from the Daily Mail. I'm not finding the other article that I had on this. But interestingly enough, when I found 3 or 4 other instances, one from 2014, where you have another judge saying the same thing. So let me just go over this real quick here. And this is not the actual text of his speech, which is what I was looking for, but this will have to suffice. So it says, collapse of nuclear families should be applauded due to the new reality of single and same-sex parents, says top family court judge. Sir James Munby is current president of the family division of the High Court. He said many Britons live in households far different from typical nuclear family. And there's missing articles not from a. So even people can't even write for these major newspapers. In a speech at Liverpool University, he said it would one day be laughable that men are asked to pay money to support their ex-wives. The collapse of the nuclear family should be welcomed and applauded, Britain's most senior family judge said yesterday. Sir James Munby, who's president of the family division of the High Court, said the modern family was complex and took an infinite variety of forms. He said that there was a new reality of single-parent households, same-sex marriages, and adopted families that the law was maddeningly slow to adapt to. Sir James said that many Britons live in families more or less removed from what, until comparatively recently, would have been recognized as a typical nuclear family, adding, "This, I stress, is not merely the reality. It is, I believe, a reality which we should welcome and applaud." In a speech at Liverpool University, Sir James said, quote, "People live together as couples, married or not, and with partners who may not always be of the other sex. Children live in households where their parents may be married or unmarried. They may be brought up by a single parent, by 2 parents, or even 3 parents. Their parents may not even be their natural parents. They may be children of parents with very different religious, ethnic, or national backgrounds. They may be the children of polygamous or polyamorous marriages. Their siblings may be only half-siblings or step-siblings. Some children are brought up by 2 parents of the same sex. Some children are conceived by artificial donor insemination. Some are the result of surrogacy arrangements." End quote. And it says recent figures from the Office for National Statistics show that about 10,000 same-sex couples have dependent children. Parental orders for surrogacy arrangements have grown from fewer to 50 in 2008 to 300 this year. It comes after what he called for an overhaul of the country's marriage laws in March, saying it one day be laughable that men were asked to pay money to support their ex-wives. Sir James called for equality for divorcees when maintenance payments are settled by the court, highlighting absurd divorce settlements that are unfairly biased against men. And then he talked about, mental health units, and he's wanting to increase mental health units, so there's much more stricter regulations to prevent suicide in mental health units, for involuntary incarceration. Now, look at that. Is that not exactly what Mead said?
Yes.
And notice he threw in this little thing there. It's like, there's unfair child support settlements for men. Guess what? Yeah, that can certainly be true. But what are you're conflating about things that divorce types of regulations that may be biased towards the women or something. But what does that have to do with these type of polygamous families and all this stuff? This is this is the High Court or the family court in England. So this is you talk about an activist judge.
Absolutely. It's just like listening to the lifestyles, what's it called? Family lifestyles of the future. Margaret Mead says, in the future, the meaning of family will go beyond blood ties to become a community of interests. Relaxed social attitudes will make marriage more popular but less permanent. There will be zero population growth and women's lib will radicalize motherhood. And then you think about this article that I found. It says, Margaret Mead's controversial ideas. Newlyweds should purchase divorce insurance. An ideal society should consist of people who are homosexual in their youth, heterosexual in middle age, and homosexual again in later years. Instead of the nuclear family, she advocated for cluster units comprised of older married couples, singles, and teenagers from other households. So communism becomes the new, like the kibbutz becomes the new way of life, right? But nobody considers what is the effect on the children. This is what makes me nuts. I mean, this is crazy. And yet we're being told to accept it as normal. Again, there is a language for this, but there's not a language around being able to break it down and to talk about it and really be able to talk about it and not have it be, deemed not politically correct. So we can really see what is happening.
Yeah. And let me just go ahead and there's another article, right? This is from February 19th, 2014. It's the end of the nuclear family, and that's not a bad thing, insists Supreme Court judge who says he fears watching couples take their wedding vows. Lord Wilson said the makeup of average British family has changed. Many families now consist of step-parents and half-blood siblings. He said this may not be a bad thing, giving children a broader experience. But he still, but then he said he still believes...
What is a broad... Oh, give me a break. I'm sorry. How do people not get upset? I don't know about you, but it's infuriating to me because people don't even stop to question what is the end game of this. It's like, hello, people, wake up. It's like, this is not good. It's like what we're doing is, again, like Bernard Laffey spoke about this in Men, Robots, and Minds, where he says basically that the majority are accepted to accept the minority as being the majority. Well, let's look at transhumanism. Transgenderism. Transhumanism actually is what they're going towards, but let's look at transgenderism. What, 0.5% of the population? LGBTQ, naturally, without it being socially engineered, possibly 3% of the population. So the majority now has to genuflect to the minority, and in order to do that, to be tolerant. And so basically, what is being encouraged, and I hope that this isn't going too far out, is disturbed sexual function. So basically what's being promoted is anything that kind of disturbs our relationship with life and affects the natural, biological, generative nature of nature. And it is substituting instead what is anti-nature, what does not create or recreate, what is not generative, is that which is being promoted.
Yeah, well, we can just go back to God and Gollum, right? But let me just continue with this. So this is another article, right? So just to stress to people that cybernetics, we'll get into this, transhumanism stuff, but just to see, again, what you're looking at is direct quotes, which Mead was posting decades and decades ago, generations ago. Technically, right? But look at this guy. So this Supreme Court judge has a slightly different slant because he's a member of the Church of England. And, he's like, widespread marriage splits are now so embedded in British culture that the average home had changed profoundly. Many families now consist of step-parents and siblings with half-blood relationships, the senior judge said, although he added this was not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, then he mentions fear. He has a sense of fear when couples take their wedding vows. Okay, the availability of divorce has had a profound effect on social demographics. So the blended family now often replaces a nuclear family. I am not convinced that is a bad thing. Might it not be healthier for children to learn at a very early age to cope with relationships in a mixed and wider family group? And then he says, member of Church of England, I still believe the traditional family is the way to go. But then he's saying that he believes, I am convinced that sexual relationships, which lead to full cohabitation between adults, are valuable, in particular to any resulting children. Okay, I would have thought at my age, I have forgotten the details, that it is highly desirable to be able to apply 4 eyes, 4 ears, 4 hugging arms, 4 tender lips, and 2 separate stress levels to the daily care of a child. But then he goes on to say that same-sex marriage and, the judge also backed David Cameron's controversial decision to legalize gay marriage, saying it strengthens unions. Judge Wilson, he says, quote, far from destroying marriage, I think that to allow same-sex couples into it strengthens it. In my view, the most important benefit of same-sex marriage is the symbol that it holds up to the heterosexual community, not forgetting teenagers apprehensively trying to make sense of their own emerging sexuality, that each of the two types of intimate adult love is as valid as the other. The availability of marriage properly dignifies same-sex love. And he's talking about marrying first cousins, and that's okay because they're marrying first cousins or even family members, and that's fine too. And that's great because that strengthens families. So notice this manipulative aspect now, not quite as blunt as the other guy, but in a sense even more, you could say worse or more pernicious, because he's saying 4 eyes, 4 lips, for a very strange kind of a metaphor, but kind of sexual.
What a weird way. Oh,
but
that's disgusting.
Any kind of sexual relationship that leads to cohabitation and produces children is great. So what, if you've got, some kind of orgiastic sex cult and they have kids, that's good for the children? Come on.
Well, and it goes back into the lifestyles of that Margaret Mead thing where she talks about the family of 3. We choose to be together. And, the one woman says, Janice and I are lovers. We have love. And I think to myself, yuck, what kids want to understand that? Kids don't want to know that. It's like, it is, again, it's a projection. It's a neurosis being projected onto children.
Yeah. Well, you have to go back to
and
Freud.
And then children are so vulnerable.
A lot of people don't know this, but for Freud, caring, tenderness, right, are forms of sexuality, that sexuality begins at birth, and the relationship of mother to child is fundamentally sexual. But this is a type of tenderness, right? That tenderness or caring is actually a type of repressed or differently manifested sexual desire and pleasure. And then he goes on to believe or state that this sort of tenderness or caring, if it's expressed in an adult, is a type of extreme pathology. And any kind of tenderness, unless it immediately is part of foreplay and immediately leads to sex, is a type of psychopathology, because people haven't grown up and they're still, back in their youth and childhood. So look at that. I mean, you're fundamentally basing everything on sex. Now, you've got people, and I know people, right? You probably do too, right? Their whole lives become this obsession with sexual gratification, where, it really can, ruin your life. It's kind of an addiction, right? It can completely warp your perception of everything, and in a sense, create so many issues and problems. And especially when you look at that gung-ho, let's experiment, 1970s, 1960s kind of model. Yeah, let's go back. If indeed, and you were mentioning to me that you thought maybe they were just actors, the whole thing was set up. But for people that heard it last week and haven't seen the video, the kids are walking in and there's the guy's in bed with 2 women, and it's like, that's my mommy, that's my dad, And so that's really cool. That's really nice. This guy is having a threesome. So what they see is that the bonds are purely.
And then he says, and I am a picture of a satisfied.
Well, you know what? But you see that. Right? That type of social engineering or process with the growth of the kind of self-help generation, that was part of the larger social restructuring that occurred after the 1950s and then the 1960s. You have a growth not only with the shift from hallucinogens to hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, but you also have this growth of this very self-centered thing and this model, right? That you can't change the world, but you can change yourself. And so you have all this kind of self-help and this idea of the me generation, right? And this idea of like, well, I want to get off. I mean, this turns me on. And if I get bored, I'm just going to run out the door. So in a certain way, you know what? It may not be pleasant. It may not be a nonstop pleasure orgy. If you're raising a child, you may have to struggle. There may be suffering. There may be difficulties. You may have to put your own interests aside in the interests of the family and also in the interests of maintaining the culture and maintaining the value system, right? That's a sacrifice, but you look at it.
Our values, look, real quick. If you think about it, where are the in our language today. They've been eviscerated.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. There's no morality in our language anymore. It's been eviscerated. Language doesn't include that anymore. It's almost as if, though, to speak about what we're talking about today is going to be deemed old-fashioned, right? No, we're all working towards the common good. That's what all this is about. We're evolving. We're progressing. There's really not a language around this anymore for what is morality. Morality is deemed like, there's no value in it. So when you're talking about values, what's really being valued and whose values are they? And are we adopting values as our own? Going back to Mr. Kurt Lewin, where are these values coming from exactly? Why do we value them? Why are we expected to value them? Because pretty soon you're going to have to, if you don't, you're going to be based on everything you do is going to be based on social credit, and you're not going to be nice. And if you don't go along with everybody and say, hey, all this stuff is wonderful, you're not going to be able to live anymore, right? Extreme. But it makes me wonder.
Well, the social credit system, right? This goes into, and we'll tie it back into this, this sort of algorithmic machine, right? And we read quotes from this thing of the design of an ideal society, where the society has this sort of supercomputer where everyone is fed into it and it makes decisions and everything is mathematized and controlled. So what people don't get, I don't think per se, is that, and it seems a little bit it's counterintuitive that the sort of expansive values, do anything you want, do what feels good, man. All right, man, if it feels good, do it, baby. All right. The whole 1960s ethos was connected or has been connected. We could make a lot of arguments that, in fact, the countercultural movement, you have people like Bateson and Mead right there at the outset, even before it even started, sort of formulating it, that this absolute control grid, right, is embedded in this type of total freedom, so to speak, or promiscuity.
But is it freedom? You make a really great point. Here's a quote by Huxley. As our political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends to compensatingly increase, and the dictator will do well to encourage that freedom in conjunction with the freedom to daydream under the influence of dope, music, movies, and radio. It will help to reconcile his subjects to the servitude which is their fate.
Yeah. And that's certainly, it's certainly the case, right? I don't think anyone could argue that. But I want to, ram the point. I'm going to beat the dead horse. Just keep beating it, right? is that, with Mead, these are things that, again, you're having the language these judges are using. You almost think, is this their own thoughts? This seems to be, and I'm sure we do more research, we can find this similar statement coming in many, many different guises. Now, the supposed bulwark of conservatism, right? We have these judges on these high courts who are supposed to uphold traditional values, even if society itself is, going against these values. And you see that they are repeating the same script, except in different ways, and manipulating it. And notice that there's a little spoonful of sugar, right? So that the Judge Wilson is like, oh, well, I still think the traditional family is the best, but, it doesn't really matter because we can have all these like crazy new types of relationships. And this is super wonderful that we can just have 4 arms, 4 eyes. That's pretty weird. And it almost creates you almost think of like some kind of weird hybrid, right? With like 4 eyes and 4 arms, some kind of a gargoyle, Gollum-esque monster, taking care of the children. All right, Kathy, let's go ahead and listen to the Margaret Mead clip right now on Faith Healing.
Okay.
One of the aspects of parapsychology that the peoples of the world have always been interested in is the question of healing disease. And we find everywhere in the world healers whom people trust and who are able to arouse in the individuals who come to them sufficient faith so that they very often go away healed, pick up their beds and walk, throw down their crutches, and walk away. Now, this sort of interaction between someone who believes in their own power to heal and the multitude who believe that they have the power to heal is a frequently recurring phenomenon and a perfectly familiar one. It depends on faith. It may depend on other things also, but we know that it can occur wherever there is faith. In the last 50 years, we've begun to study something called psychosomatic medicine, or the interaction that occurs between mental states and somatic states that we do not think of as mental, because we tend to split the body or the human person into these two parts. We actually ought to talk either about psychosomatic or somatopsychic, because you can get vicious circles set up to start with a very bad stomachache and end with a broken heart, or you can have circles that begin with a broken heart and end with a stomachache. And you can have intervention at any point, but the intervention that's necessary to heal the broken heart is rather different from the intervention that's necessary to heal a stomach ulcer. And so one can have pharmaceutical intervention, one can have intervention by faith, one can have intervention by a realignment of the individual's goals and hopes. And undoubtedly, the study of psychosomatic medicine and somopsychic medicine have given us new insights into the processes that occur when healing occurs. But they, again, are not sufficient explanation for many of the phenomena that occur in this world, for which at present we have no explanation.
All right. Interesting, huh? And for those that want to see the video, Margaret Mead is wearing all red clothing, red and black, sitting behind a red background, which is quite interesting, right? Red and black, of course, are the colors of Satanism.
Oh my God, Hans, look at the video again and look at black out collar going down around her is. It looks phallic.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd choice of clothing.
Oh my gosh, it looks. I don't know if you can compute right now. Not it like it looks like a male genitalia outlined on her clothing. And the interesting thing is that her, whatever it is she's wearing, basically blends into the background. They're almost the same colors of, and so that makes the outline on her clothing that much more apparent. It looks like she's wearing a phallus.
Yeah, it does. It's rather odd. And now, again, there's a huge psychological component to disease, right? There's a huge component of mental.
Right, because she talks about mental, let's just go back. She talks about mental states and somatic states. And what's fascinating, they're split into two parts. Well, it's a split schizophrenic, right? So there's a divorce from the mental state and the somatic state.
Yeah. But notice also this is around the same time as Jim Jones, and the first preacher she's showing looks remarkably like Jim Jones, right? And that was another CIA operation that was used to experiment, right? It was another outgrowth of this whole kind of MK Ultra experimentation that was, deployed on a captive population. But there's many, many examples of this. And it's not only MK Ultra, right? MK Ultra is a specific type of a program. And as we mentioned last week, a lot of the funding for this research was being funneled through the Macy conferences to various CIA research programs and other types of, non-governmental research into this stuff. So there's a lot of interest in both saying things that, okay, that idea is not counterintuitive, right? If you have, your mental state is bad, then you're going to have a much greater likelihood of having disease. Okay. But there's also, do you think there's an undercurrent here that we should be besides her rather unfortunate fashion choices? Do you think there's an undercurrent here that we should be aware of in terms of what she's revealing or talking about?
Well, I thought that what really stuck out for me is vicious when she talks about the psychosomatic and the somatopsychic and the split and vicious circles, because vicious circles, again, tie into cybernetics, right? And feedback. A vicious circle means that feedback keeps coming in and nothing changes it. Vicious circles are used a lot in psychology, and how people keep creating, almost have a compulsion to create what they say they don't want and what is painful. But they really don't have the ability on their own to change it.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the awareness of it. So I think that's very important. You know, it's like I don't listen to things the same way that I used to a few months ago. So I've gotten into this because I realized just how very important words are, colors, like just looking at Margaret Mead's clothing right now. I might not have been paying so much attention and picked up on the shape that the black outline is producing on her clothing. And we can dismiss it and say, oh, that's really not that big. Isn't it funny? Black outline on her clothing. But what we don't understand is the effect that this has on us and how it's affecting our perception and what else might be being embedded into our minds that we're not aware of.
Yes. And there's a great quote from Michael Hoffman's seminal work, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, where he talks about the types of things that are deployed on an everyday basis in the media would have caused, you know, villagers in the Middle Ages to burn the building down or something, you know, people to riot because it's so anomalous and so disconcerting. But we've become immune to these things. At the same time, there is a tendency to seek out, right? There's a sort of inversion of the life instinct. And I remember reading about this years and years ago in conjunction with certain types of, you know, hard rock, heavy metal, or things like that, you know, were shown to kill plants, but also to sort of negate the life instinct, right? But at the same time, it creates this sort of attraction. And so you can become attracted towards things that are actually going against your own best interests.
Yes.
Or the
look
larger
at rap. Like a young friend of mine shared with me. I admit I'm out of touch with all of this, and he shares with me like rap videos and things. And he shared with me this little Peep video, and I was shocked. I was like, this is disgusting. And then Suicide Boys. It's like, it's such an inversion of life. I mean, they are promoting anti-life. And it's like kids will even show their parents videos of these rappers, and then they take videos of the parents' reactions to them. And thank God the parents are having reactions like this. Disgusting. But what's scary to me is that as a parent, I had no idea. And then I'm wondering, what is my daughter watching that I'm not aware of? And what is the impact that these videos are having? You know, you talk about rock music and things from the past, but then you look at videos today, rap videos, unbelievable.
Yeah. And who is the guy, the rapper that recently was supposedly killed in the shooting?
XXS or something?
Yep. And you have people like cut for X or whatever. And there was a whole hashtag Twitter thing where people were slicing their own bodies in memoriam of this rapper who was absolutely deeply connected with all kinds of occult things and right on the surface. It's not some kind of hidden message. He absolutely embraced evil and promoted all this stuff. And you see this level of violence and negativity and negation and destruction that's worshipped, and there's also the destruction of language and this idea of anti-communication. So we look at within the cybernetic model, one thing is we've talked about is a communication and anti-communication. Well, the contemporary type of rap music is an example of anti-communication because at least within the whatever is existing, right, within the sort of mores of our society, this is an anathema. It goes against this, as well as sort of destroying language and as well as dulling the mind. So it becomes impossible even to listen to more developed types of music. Your brain becomes lazy. It becomes very difficult, right? If you haven't, say, for example, you haven't read a book in like 15 years, which is probably the case for a lot of people. When you start trying to read again, it's going to be uncomfortable because, your brain is your neuroplasticity means that your brain is constantly changing. You're constantly creating patterns, or else you're not utilizing existing systems, and these systems start to atrophy and they start to decay. And I think they can be resurrected, but the further that process of atrophy goes, the more difficult it is, the more painful, the more physically uncomfortable, because, you have to really push yourself. It's just like being out of shape physically. You can't just immediately go run a marathon. You'll have a heart attack and die if you're out of shape physically. The same thing with the brain itself. If you get into these types of patterns, and what they do, they create tracks, right? They're type of neurophysiological tracks that become reinforced, continually reinforced. And then we go back into this, cognitive inhibition. I looked up cerebral inhibition. I didn't find a reference on that, but cognitive inhibition, again, is where your brain will cut out certain things because when you're focusing on a task at hand, right? So for example, if I'm working on a writing project, in my mind, if I'm listening to all the sounds around me, or I'm, focused completely on my physical state and other things like that, I may not be able to focus on the act of writing. So it's certainly a necessary process, right? In order to concentrate, you can't, if you focus on everything around you, you're not going to be able to focus on the task at hand. On the other hand, if this is manipulated, if you have these types of mental conditioning apparatus that serve to remove the ability of the mind even to perceive what is actually going on, and to attract the mind towards this type of, you could say, anti-life, this type of negation, this type of negativity and destructive impulses, and trick yourself, destroying not only the moral sense, but also making the organism itself work towards its own destruction, I think is kind of fundamental to that.
Well, it's like suicide. When you look at the rap videos that are being put up today, and the fact that they're suiciding them, like with that, I don't know what the guy's name was, XXX and Lil Peep and all of these rappers that are dying, it really does induce a form of suicide. When you watch the videos that are associated with them, they're so dark, and they're imprinting something in the mind that, why bother? There's a sense of hopelessness. Hey, it's cool to kill yourself. This dulling of the mind where people can't make sense. And to your point, the mind will make shortcuts using the reticular activating system. And I'm bringing that in just because I want to create continuity over the last few weeks of what we've been speaking about. Because what you were talking about is that you said the brain creates tracks, and they get reinforced. Well, that's how the reticular activating system works. It becomes conditioned. And the more stressed we are from a somatic standpoint, the less conscious perception we're going to have. And so we're going to see things more from a fight or flight standpoint. And we're going to interpret information coming in a bit of a distorted way based on the somatic state. And my hunch is that rap music induces a form of threat to the body. Like, listen to the beats. I mean, I personally can't listen to it for very long because it makes me feel anxious. But what happens when you get habituated to listening to this kind of music? It makes you numb.
Well, there's a embodied, you could say, somatic sense that people disregard. It's just like, say, for example, smoking, right? The first time someone has a cigarette, usually it tastes like crap. They don't like it, but eventually they start doing it and they become addicted. Or even alcohol, right? Which, I'm not necessarily saying anything against alcohol, but you first taste it, it tastes like crap, right? But you get habituated to it because, in a sense, well, not in a sense, it is a type of poison, right? And another level too that we have to see is that with this occult ideology, right? Whether or not you want to posit the existence of, non-physical entities we could call demonic possession or demonic states or other types of, say, astral entities. The fact is that especially John Dee and all this alchemical magical workings are heavily linked with this idea of drawing in beings from astral types of planes and in fact inducing types of trance possession through these processes. And so as your sense of yourself starts to decay, as your sense of right and wrong, a type of moral atrophy, it also can potentially open yourself up to quote unquote possession, where you lose your sense of yourself, right? That you become, in a sense, a disembodied type of entity. And so then you can sort of be manipulated almost like a golem or a puppet, and the puppet masters are pulling the strings, and yet you think that you are embracing and enjoying your life. And in fact, you're negating whatever purpose you have been brought into this earth to do. And at the same time, you look at these value systems where this idea of just wealth for the sake of wealth, celebrity for the sake of celebrity, and these types of value systems where even if you could do something, it doesn't have any value unless it's seen by 100 million people, right? So this whole idea of the work or the creative work having a sort of a resonance that stands outside of, you could say, outside of temporality or outside of the matrix of just production and consumption is negated to where even the worst garbage, oh, that person's famous, so it must be good, right? So there's, the actual innate sense is continually atrophied, and that ties back into what we started out with, this idea that ideas must be counterintuitive, right? So you want to deny, I would say actually kind of a survival instinct that gives you a sense, well, this is harmful. Like if you listen to it and feel anxiety, there's probably a reason for that. Maybe it's doing things to your physiology or to your mind that are not healthy, that are not conducive for healthy functioning.
I completely agree. And as you were talking about all that, what came to mind is Gers Mulot, and I hope I'm not like reading too much stuff, but I just find it fascinating. He says the Pavlovian strategy in populations has conditioned more and more people to ask themselves, what do other people think? As a result, a common delusion is created. People are incited to think what other people think, and thus public opinion may mushroom out into a mass prejudice. So as you talked about that, the atrophying of the ability to gain a sense of oneself or who are you? Because there's so much stimulus. Another thing that's coming to me as I'm doing this research is we don't pay attention to how much stimulus we're exposed to daily. So, consider a person that has to commute to work every day, and especially if you're commuting, like using public transportation, you're constantly inundated, not just with stimulus from technology, but from other people, crowding. There's so much to take in, and it begins to numb the mind.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, I'm actually going to go ahead. We're going to take our top of the hour break here in just a minute, and I'm going to go ahead and play one of my own tracks here. This is from that album called New Revolution, and hopefully this music does not atrophy the mind. That's why why I did it. But Kathy, during the break, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and restart the call because you are breaking up a little bit. We're getting a few
breaking
seconds
up a
here.
lot too. I can't hear you. So what did you say? I didn't hear you.
I said we're going to go ahead. I'm going to play a track here. We're going to go ahead and restart our call. So we'll be right back.
Start my computer too.
Okay, we'll be right back in about 8 minutes. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. Eyes wide open. We'll be getting the website up soon, hansutter@hotmail.com. Feel free to drop me a line. We're on the Steemit, Steampunk with 2 E's, and we are also on the Awake Radio Network. All right, everybody, we'll be right back. right, everybody, welcome back. So I guess I can talk over and cut out my own guitar solo there because it's my prerogative, right? And I'm wondering why I'm still getting a signal even though it says 0 decibels on the monitor. But anyways, we are back, and that is a track off an album I did a few months ago. And I played all the instruments in that particular track, all the production, everything. So that was kind of a major headache, but hey, I got it done. And that's all we can kind of hope for in life, I think, is to get things done. So anyways, how about this goal setting that just brought to my mind that getting things done, right? That listophilia, which, I do kind of like lists. I try to get off lists, and I think I'm a list addict, perhaps. But there is something to be said, right? In even going back to that faith healing clip, she says getting new goals and new directions. And so the process of goal setting, you almost wonder, just like all this information, there's such a process of inversion where what's up, when you say up, you actually mean down. When you say down, you mean up. When you say communication, you're actually positing that as a source of violence, and any type of social stability is inherently violent if you want to pull that apart more deeply, right? So that which works to go against meaningful structures is anti-communication, which is positive. And just like this idea of choices, to have more and more choices, do we really need more choices, or we need to make the right choice? And a choice is different from a decision, right? So when you have too many choices, it's actually worse, right? I mean, if you can't have any type of mental focus, and you suddenly have, a million different choices, say for gender, for example, since we've been kind of talking about that, is that a positive state? Or, isn't it easier, and isn't it more efficient, and isn't it more conducive to a sense of satisfaction and happiness that if you have limited choices, but you can make simple decisions that produce positive benefits instead of being in this awash in all these possible destinies, right? Or destinations.
Absolutely. And this is something interesting. I used to love to listen to Dan Ariely's work. He does a lot of work on behavioral economics, which along with neuroscience are code words. But one of the things that he talks about is some of the work that Barry Schwartz did on the paradox of choice. And that we think we want more and more choices, but the more choices we have, the more challenged we are in making a decision. And the more people regret the decisions they make when there are too many choices. So it causes a form of stress, and it's another form of stimulus. And so they know that, like, if you offer 23 different types of jams, people will be more likely to not buy the jam than if you offer 6 different choices of jam. And so what they find is that reducing the number of choices makes people feel more satisfied with the choices they make than when more choices are being offered. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because here we live in a world where there's so much, and yet there's such a profound sense of dissatisfaction amongst people. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, certainly. And, it's hard to know what's actually going on in people's minds, right? And we don't necessarily want to project that we understand everything, but, based on what we can see, based on the statistics of mental health, based on the statistics of intelligence decreasing rapidly, at least the IQ test, right? We really see a downward spiral of humanity sort of concomitant with these lots and lots of arrays of choices. But the fact is that, again, the word decide comes from the Latin word to cut, right? So you're cutting away, you're pruning, you're making a decision. To be decisive means you take a course of action and you cut off those other alternatives. Well, that is, if you're not able to do that, you're just going to keep drifting around. And again, going back to, there's a Bruin, talks about, well, every time you make a choice, you actually lose something, but we just want to keep proliferating and adding more and more choices. Well, is that really true? I mean, you look at that, like what you just said about it, it creates a stress because you're not able to have any type of grounding where, in a sense, if you're on the proper direction in your life, so to speak, you may not need to make that many choices because you've decided to do something. So, for example, if I want to become a great athlete or a martial artist and my friends are going out drinking and doing cocaine till 6 a.m. and I have a martial arts competition the next day, that's probably that, if that even becomes a choice, right? If I'm worried about that, if I'm not strong enough in my own direction, that can actually usurp and potentially I can get thrown off course by that, because I made that example up. That's certainly, I'm not, it's not, there's nothing whatsoever, based on my life in that thing. But that's just what popped in my head, was this idea that, if you get thrown off course by that, right, then you become a victim of your own inability to make decisions simply and clearly, and just, you're able to say, hey, no, I can't go out, guys. I have to focus on what I'm doing. Maybe you'll lose some friends. Maybe you don't need those kind of people as your friends ultimately. But if you find that as you're taught that that's a type of freedom, right? This is what you should be engaged in, then you're going to have that added psychological mechanism that's going to kind of push you towards these types of behaviors. Like, go back to the 21st, family of the 21st century. Well, that guy, he's having his kinky lifestyle with 2 women, and it sounds pretty good, right? But he's making a choice that is purely selfish and purely based on this sexual gratification, which, guess what? It's not going to last forever. What are you going to do? Add a pet into the equation, or add like 4 more women? I mean, eventually you're going to get bored. Eventually there's going to be conflicts. There's going to be types of
you just found something
behavior.
really important is the habituation with stimulation. And what you just hit on is really important, and it connects to choice. That when there's so much novelty coming in, that people, when there's too much novelty coming in on a consistent basis, it habituates the mind, and they need more and more stimulus. And I'm going to make a jump here. This is what happens with online pornography, is that people that watch a lot of that become so numb to what they're watching that they start watching things they would never otherwise watch, because they become so numb to all the stimulus from it. So you think about what is a very intimate thing becomes a product, becomes something that people consume. And it also has a really significant effect on how people think about themselves in the world, and what it's doing to their minds, and the way that they're thinking about things, the way that they're operating from a somatic standpoint that they might not even be aware of.
Yeah. And one of the fundamental tenets in any type of self-development is sacrificing or giving up certain things in order to do other things. And I'm going to
share with you there. I'm going to interrupt real quick, because there's a lot of controversy around that. It goes back into the marshmallow test that was given to kids when they were younger. Are you familiar with that?
No.
So the way that whole thought stream came about is that they did tests with young children, and they would put a marshmallow on a plate and they would leave, and they would tell the child, don't eat the marshmallow until I come back. Something to that effect. And so they would study the children, and they made correlations to say that those children that were able to stultify their impulses and could wait in later in life could achieve more, because they were able to manage impulse control. And so there are other studies that have come up that have questioned that. And yet the whole marshmallow study about the ability to delay gratification might not always be true. And it kind of turns into, when I was listening to you speak before, I was thinking about when you say what people should do, what you're supposed to do. Well, where do those themes come from? What are you supposed to do? What should you do? Are you supposed to now become a transgender? Is that now what the new meme is going to be? So the American dream is going to shift in that way, and that's what you should do, and that's what you should aspire for? Do we ever stop to consider what do we think we should be doing? Does that resonate?
I think so. Yeah. And Kathy, could you just turn your gain down on your mic just a hair?
Sure.
Yep. But you sound great anyways, but.
So, I really think about that. And then it ties into, I'm going to make another jump right now. I found that one article from Barry Schwartz that I was looking for. And he says that adding options to people's lives can't help but increase the expectations people have about how good those options will be. And that's what's going to produce less satisfaction with results, even when they are still good results.
Why don't you pull that apart a little bit?
So think about it. The more options we have, and not to say options aren't good or choices aren't good, but when there's so many, then we worry, did I make the right one? Well, I could have made a different one. And so when there's so many options, we then think that we almost create higher expectations about what the result should be. And then when the result isn't what we expect because our expectations are so high, then we're disappointed. And so people aren't as satisfied. And it's one thing that I think about in the United States, we have so much, and yet people are less and less satisfied, and yet they strive for more and more things. So we were sold at one point, and I think it was Norbert Wiener that said that it was Adorno, who said that technology is going to free people up so they can have more leisure time and do more things they want to do in their lives. Well, the reality is that people are working longer and harder than ever, and they're thinking less than ever. And it would appear that people have less satisfaction with their lives, even though they have more and more options.
Yeah. And in that token, let me go back to that marshmallow study, because there was another study related to this idea, sort of, we have like a self-discipline muscle. And they said that people that gave into their impulses and they were told not to eat these, like whatever there were, chocolate chip cookies or sweets. And then those that ate the chocolate chip cookies were able to perform better at the task. And those that didn't eat the cookies and use their self-discipline muscle, whatever you want to call it, so to speak, performed worse. So now you wonder about that. Is that really true? In that, what is that study saying? It's saying that, well, you have a limited amount of discipline in the day that you can actually get yourself to do stuff. And if you exercise too much self-discipline, then you're going to be done for the day, and your muscle, your quote unquote self-discipline system, whatever the heck that is posited to be, will run out of gas. So you need to, use it in certain ways, and certain types of the subtext is certain types of indulgences are good. And it doesn't mean, I think that, one of the things that's missing here is just that it doesn't even need to be this type of horrible or difficult process if you're focused on what you need to do, and then you don't, on what you need to do, meaning that, okay, whatever, you need to do, meaning that your goal or whatever you're working towards, or however you've designed your life, if that's in place in a natural way, then you don't really have to even consider these choices. Now, sometimes, right, there are instances where you need to kind of expand the platforms of available possibilities and directions. But that's usually, I think, when you're stuck, when you're going around in patterns and you see you're just repeating similar patterns and not getting the results you want. Well, then it can be valuable to intercede with different types of options or try out different things. So I'm not saying that you have to be like some kind of a robot, but on the other hand, like you said, you have all these choices, and look at the notifications, right? I got one on my phones. I stopped using it because I couldn't turn off notifications. And in fact, to be honest, like, I sort of got off social media because I kept getting these notifications. It started stressing me out. I'm like, I don't need this. And maybe I missed some important communications. In fact, I better check my messages, because I probably have. But I get, it's this constant like bombardment. But then I've also read that people that when they get a little high every time they get that little ping or that buzzer, or
a dopamine rush,
you've got
right?
mail. For me, I'm like, dude, I'm trying to get some work done, and I don't necessarily look upon that. I look at it as more of an annoyance. It depends, right? If someone's offering me a nice concert with lots of money, I'm going to make sure that I don't miss that contact. And to be honest, this whole thing has actually made me more sort of antisocial in terms of social media, and partially also because of the fact that, of course, it's all regulated and monitored and algorithmized, whatever, to create these types of personality profiles. And then again, we go into the total information awareness with that wonderful, eye in the pyramid beaming down onto the planet. Well, the TIA, which was, so over the top that it was shut down. Well, that Facebook, there you go, it's voluntary. We'll go ahead and collect all the data and have every kind of personal thing, and all these things, these likes, all these things can be microtimed, right? Everything you do online can be microtimed and analyzed in a whole host, in a whole array of configurations. So it really, it not only creates a very detailed type of information where you can really start to understand things people may not even know about themselves, but also you can shape these processes, and you can continue to not only gather data, but at the same time you're creating the data, you're creating the individual, so to speak, by these types of systems. And so you look at our increased leisure time. Well, if you got constant emails, and even if you have a great salary and you're never really off the clock, then what kind of life do you really have? You may be up in the mountains, you get a phone call, you have to do this or that. Well, I mean, sometimes that's the price of success, but at the same time, I think that this has gone over the top, right? In terms of constantly being wired in. Well, don't you need time to yourself? Isn't it? There has to be some
but I'm
type
going
of
to say this,
filtering
but
mechanism.
it's also a way for people to avoid themselves. So when you think about it, life is much more complex when you have balance in life, when you have balance between like your home life, your family life, your relationships, and work. But what you were just saying about the phone, always pinging you, or your email, and you're always responding to it, it's easy to say, hey, honey, I can't do this right now. I've got work to do. So you don't have to deal with the complexities of a relationship. You can then gravitate towards work. And then even though work might not always be so pleasurable, it's not as complex to deal with as it is with relationships and balancing other things in your life.
Yeah. And going back to the whole thing with families, right? If you lose this idea that there is something, you say flesh and blood or family. Well, guess what? There's a lot of reasons why that is real. Now, if you sacrifice to a certain extent, and it doesn't mean that and that sacrifice may be actually imposing a type of discipline on the child, right? That may be necessary. Then
or a boundary. I mean, but let's think about these terms. It's like sometimes the words we use. There's a discipline, which implies punishment. And this is really important because it ties into cybernetics, and it ties into control theory and goals, and the types of goals that people set for themselves. But when you say the thing of discipline, there's a difference between discipline and boundaries. And it goes into our goals that people set based on what they want to do, which is aspirational, or our goals set on what they think they should do and must do, which tend to create stress for a person. So just even the language we use around these things is really important.
Yeah, and the language, I think, is also connected with the reticular activating system, because when the meaning of a word changes, or you don't understand what the word means, or else things are framed in such a way that you can't see other options, or you're perceiving it in a specific type of mode, then you become lost, or you also can make, you fail to make distinctions. And that's part of language. I think that people forget that to really understand the meaning of words and how they're used is very important to develop a type of precision, because that develops a type of precision in your thought. And that's what we see in this cybernetic stuff, right? Unless you know the hidden meanings behind the language, and all this other stuff that's going on there, you're going to not understand what the hell they're talking about. And you will, in a sense, become a victim of other people's ideologies that you don't even understand what they are, but you ingrain them, and then thereby you create sort of a self-replicating pattern, right? You yourself become like a cybernetic entity. And so you become a sort of a golem, right? You can become like a slave. And that's exactly what happens with pornography, or people that are getting these dopamine responses from, the message pings, and they go into depression if people don't like them on Facebook, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have this disembodied state where you no longer are capable of actually connecting with your own embodied, biologic, natural state of being a living human being. And then also things become, you're not able to make value judgments where, maybe it's more important that you spend time with your family than it is that you go out and, work 150 hours of overtime, because ultimately that money will come and go. Now, if you're starving, that's a different thing, but that money will come and go. But that time, especially with a child, will never come back, right? If you miss important years in your child's life, that time is never going to come back. You're never going to get that back. That's a loss that is
and it's a loss to your child. So here's the other thing. It's a loss to the child also, that they don't have the presence of their parent there. And we underestimate it because we're let off the hook all the time around it. It's really not that important. You just have to spend quality time with your child. But the thing is, what does that really mean? And so I really think this is so important and it's so easy to gloss over when you talk about this embodied state or this disembodied state. It really means, like, how connected are we to our senses, and how able are we to discern what we're experiencing from our senses? Because sometimes our senses can lead us to mislead us. Like you and I talked earlier before we started this call today about how sometimes our intuition can punk us, that we have an intuition around something and yet it might not be correct. So it's this paradox about being able to listen to your intuition, being able to take in information from your senses. And I love what you said about, develop a type of precision in your thinking and how you're reflecting on these things. It's super important.
Yeah. And it's analogous to when you get into good physical shape, then you're going to be attracted towards challenging and pushing your body and things like that. Unless you go over the top. And my God, speaking of, I'm getting strafed with phone calls here from random numbers, which is really annoying. And I really get angry. I get all these, fake. I was getting calls, Chinese calls, like, these random calls. And the problem for me is I may get a call from someone that's out of state that's going to hire me for an event. And I may not take the call because I keep getting these calls from numbers I don't recognize. And half of them are just these BS calls. And that to me, that is an impingement on myself, that people can just do that on a cell phone and just strafe me with calls. Because I'm just saying that because my phone is like ringing off the hook. But
well, see, my phone is turned off.
Well, mine, yeah, I'm waiting I'm actually about to travel here. So I have to make sure my lodging arrangements are taken care of. And
no, but I think all of this is really important about this whole sense of how easy, just like what's happening right now with what we're experiencing, is how easy it is to get distracted by that, how easy it is to get distracted by a ping. So it's like I'm super deep into reading and researching right now, and I have to turn off my computer monitor because even when the sound is down, peripheral vision, I can tell like when a new email comes in and it distracts me, and I'll go ahead and I'll look at my computer and I'm like, what was I just reading? I forgot. And so it breaks my attention span. And so I recognize that I really need to pay attention to the stimulus that's around me because it's affecting me in ways I might not be aware of. And it can keep me from reaching my goal.
Well, and that's also this fracturing of attention. So this idea of multitasking, which is, everyone's like, oh, I'm multitasking. Well, actually multitasking, if you keep doing that, you basically start to erode your ability to actually concentrate and focus. And it becomes very difficult. And, there's people that, when they study, they have to have heavy metal blasting and things like that. And maybe that can work, but there's so much that is done to us that works to fragment our levels of attention and awareness. And notice that when you go to the elite private schools, or we say public schools in the UK, that guess what? A lot of them, they're not even allowed to have computers. And then you go to our regular, even top rated public school districts, they are surrounded, inundated, not only by Wi-Fi signals, but everything is constantly done on these computers and this and that and all this computerized testing.
It's crazy. So I had a meeting with my daughter's school. She's in high school. And I got feedback. We were talking about one of her tests and I got the results. I'm like, you are in big time trouble here. I mean, you told me you were going to be getting like a B. You got a D. What happened? And I reached out to her teacher and she's like, oh, she was so busy on her phone. And I'm thinking, I cut her phone off. You know, like on the carrier that we have, you can turn the phone off during certain hours. I'm like, what's going on here? And she's like, oh, she can pick up the Wi-Fi at the school. And I said, well, then as a parent, what am I supposed to do? I've already asked her, please don't do it. And she still did it. I mean, I hope that's not a reflection of my parenting ability, but I mean, she still did it. And then I cut off her darn phone and then she can still get onto Wi-Fi at school. And I said, well, can you help me out here? What can we do? And the teacher said, well, we're not allowed to take phones from the students anymore. We're not allowed to tell them to turn it off. And I'm like, you're just setting me up in a complete double bind. What are we supposed to do? I am incredulous that students are allowed to have their phones out at school. I had no idea. And here's the thing. Most parents don't realize what's happening in the school system anymore. We're so disconnected. It's almost like we project and think what school was like when we were in school is kind of a bit iterated. It's a little bit different. No, it's completely different.
Yeah. And, you know, there was the physical discipline, right? I remember my principal had this big paddle. And if you screwed up, he would whack you. Okay. Well, that happened to me once. It kind of sucked, but hey, I'm still, surviving, even though for myself, right? Because I was in a certain way potentially targeted, at least in elementary school and stuff. I mean, there were people that were just really brutal, and this was possibly based on my Germanic name and all this stuff, which, I get into all that array of stuff, but we find that the parents, these are environments, right? You see these, like these video games and all these things, they're highly addictive. They're designed to be addictive. And my son is really into video game stuff. So I played some games with him, and I've got to sense there's such a deep loneliness of, not being able to connect in these sort of gaming environments that I felt, it almost like hit me like there's, and there's articles and stuff I've seen too about young men, retreating into the video games, right? This becomes the only field available for masculinity. And we could go on and on about this.
And then they bring in Jordan Peterson to reach out to all of those disaffected young men, right? Who then crafts his own narrative. And he has this whole thing, ironically, all around goal setting. So it's like there's an app for that. So, these young men who are connected but disconnected. It reminds me of this book called Alone Together. And Reisman spoke about it, how people are more lonely. They're connected, but through technology. But that doesn't affect the whole mind and that connection of that I'm being held positively in somebody else's mind, which is really critical to one's sense of self and sense of safety and stability in the world. And so these people are instead connecting technologically and feeling even more alone. And then Jordan Peterson sweeping down, right? And reaching out to these young men and creating narratives in such a way. And it sounds really good. And so here's the thing about Jordan Peterson in this way. A lot of what he says sounds really good. And so we miss the other aspects of what he's doing.
Yeah. And to be honest, like when I first encountered Jordan Peterson, I'm like, okay, well, this guy is like speaking truth to power. He's really, and obviously he's not going to go super far in certain areas. And so I thought, well, within this context, this guy is pretty good because he's obviously erudite and he's introducing people to thought. But, the whole thing started when we found that video of him crying, or I brought that up, right? That was so bizarre and it was so weird. And I'm like, what is this guy doing? Because either he's just an emotional wreck and he's and he's kind of but he actually was showing like the ultimate, well, excuse my French here, but sort of the ultimate feminized or pussified man. Like you can't even read your stilted little diatribe without bursting into tears. But it was so artificial and so contrived. And then you find out, well, this guy's worked for all these foundations and has all these major connections. He just didn't, come out of nowhere. He was recruited, decades ago, and they were looking to create types of public intellectuals. And so that's quite interesting. But, Kathy, speaking of public intellectuals, we're going to go ahead and we have this Paul Pangaro, is that how you pronounce it? Paul Pangaro,
I think so. Mm-hmm.
lecture, The Future of Cybernetics. And, we would certainly love to talk more. Unfortunately, I have to travel here and I'm already kind of pushing the temporal threshold. But let's go ahead and check out The Future of Cybernetics and we'll come back in and talk.
I'm lacking the clicker.
Okay.
Somebody has to bring me a clicker, but I'm going to dance in the meantime, okay? So nobody knows what cybernetics is, or at least they think they do, and it's always confusing to them. Do people here know what cybernetics is? What do you think? Do you know what cybernetics is? Is it androids? They have to get the clicker from the other speaker. You know what cybernetics is. What is cybernetics? The science of controlling machines and humans. That's a really brilliant way to think about it. How do you know that? How do you know that it's the science of controlling?
I don't know.
You read about it, good. Well, this is about the future of cybernetics, and not just the present. One that works? Terrific. There we go. So I chair an interaction design program in Detroit at the College for Creative Studies. And interaction design and cybernetics are very closely aligned. I know that might not seem to be the case. But I'm here to tell you what the future of cybernetics is. That's what I was asked to talk about. So the future of cybernetics is robotics. People very often think cybernetics, robotics, yeah, that's obviously the same thing. But cybernetics is not robotics. Have you ever heard the word biomechatronics? It's a wonderful word. Say it with me. Biomechatronics. It's a wonderful word. It's prosthetic devices that have electronic connections to the nervous system. Cybernetics is not biomechatronics. The future of cybernetics is artificial intelligence. Everybody know this movie? A movie called Her? Who saw the movie Her? Practically everybody saw the movie Her. Well, I'm sorry, but cybernetics is not AI. These are different things. And I want to tell you what that difference is. So just in summary, it's not freezing dead people, okay? I hope you feel better about that. I know that you were worried. So what is cybernetics? It's the art of steering. I know that sounds surprising, and it has something to do with control. Maybe control is kind of a loaded word. We don't like the word control. But it has to do with steering because cybernetics is a word that comes from the Greek word meaning to steer. And not just to steer in any old way, but to pilot carefully to get to your goal. So imagine that you're a ship and you set out toward your goal, but you're blown off course by wind and tide. And so you correct, right? There's a difference between where you want to go and where you're going, and you see that difference. That difference is called feedback. Everybody know what feedback means? Yes? People know what feedback means? Good. If you look at the Google Ngram, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it tells you the frequency of which words have been used in books that have been written over many decades. And the Ngram for feedback is very, very low, and in the 1940s it goes up like this, because suddenly it begins to be used at an incredible frequency. So cybernetics is the art of getting what you want. It's the art of steering, of having a goal, aiming toward your goal, and using feedback to get back. So it's this circular process. In the case of a boat, it's seeing where you are compared to getting into the port and adjusting the rudder to go in the right direction. But it's really everywhere, and it's this general idea of sensing the world, comparing what you want to what you have, and then acting to get what you want. And it's this circular loop. So for the first time, it's a science or a discipline or maybe even an art which is about achieving goals and getting purpose. And this is where it began. But it's everywhere. Clinical practice in medicine. It's the same loop. In management, the scientific method is this. The design process, you measure something, you compare whether you're getting to what you want, and then you act to design better. It's a simple thing. When we use our mobile devices, we use the phone in our pocket as an extension of our nervous system to see what we might get and what we might want, and then we act at a distance in order to do that. Now, technologically and technically, this is what it looks like. Don't be scared. It's the same thing. It's just a simple loop. This is a thermostat, right? You set the thermostat. It heats the air, not in here. This is an exception. Usually it heats the air. You are warm enough, it turns off the heater. It's this constant cycle of sensing, acting, and sensing. This is the general example. It's also true in the human body. There are countless mechanisms in the human body. You may have heard the word homeostatic mechanisms. I'm sure you've heard it. This is a cybernetic cycle. It's a way of getting what you want, of regulating. Social systems also have regulatory properties. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is about robotics, it is about AI, but it's fundamentally about purpose. This is where you have two systems controlling each other, or rather the inner system being controlled by the outer system. If you zoom in, the outer system is setting the goal of the inner system. So you can take these feedback loops and you can nest them. One very important example is you have inside loop controlling the temperature of the air, again, not here, but usually. And so when you're still too cold, you change the goal of the thermostat. You set it from 68 to 70 degrees. These are really very simple ideas, but they come out of a very deep discipline. The discipline began in the 1940s. This is a book that's perhaps the most famous marker of cybernetics. Nearly everyone knows, those of us who know cybernetics, know the Norbert Wiener book. And he was this extraordinary man, a savant, a genius, a mathematician. And he wrote a book of that name, and this is usually how we think about cybernetics originating. But there were many people involved in the origins of cybernetics. I love this picture. This man, Warren McCullough, this woman, Margaret Mead, were at the foundation of cybernetics. And they gathered together dozens and dozens of scientists and sociologists and thinkers from all different walks and disciplines to create a set of meetings called the Macy meetings. Look at this wonderful subhead: circular causal feedback mechanisms in biological and social systems. They don't even have to say electrical, mechanical, digital, etc. It was about all of those things. So Margaret Mead's name is here at the bottom. The other name here is Heinz von Forster, who I had the privilege of knowing. Extraordinary man, physicist trained, very influential in the field of cybernetics. He wrote books like this. This is not a typo, by the way, Understanding. He really did mean that, not a typo. And he was involved in these meetings at a very early stage. This is a list of names. You won't probably know the names, but look at the list of disciplines. All of these disciplines were involved at the beginning of cybernetics. It was a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary world at the time. But it's all about the art of steering. It's all about this circular causal reasoning. This is a man I studied with for many years, Gordon Pask, a genius, a savant. He took it in a different direction. He went from simple feedback loops to interactive machines. This is one of the machines he built. It was called Musicolor. Imagine, if you will, someone playing a keyboard. The keyboard input is taken by a simple microphone into a box, and the box has a reaction that is shown in lights. This causes a feedback loop. This was no simple reactive machine. This isn't you play the bass and you get green and you play the treble and you get yellow. This was much more subtle. This was a conversation. He carried this around England in the 1950s, 60 years ago, and he installed it with these light displays, 5 of them in all, to display on scrims or sheets or curtains that were put up for this purpose. And he carried around this machinery, which quite often exploded, by the way. True story. How did Musicolor work, and why was it interesting? Well, imagine that you're playing between middle C and C above C, and you begin playing. The machine adjusts itself to give you some reaction in the color wheels, which can change color and can also change the amount of brightness. But the more you play in that area, it gets kind of uninteresting, don't you think? It would be sort of boring. So Musicolor gets bored, and it stops reacting. So while the player is playing and Musicolor stops reacting, the player goes, wait a minute, It's not reacting to me anymore. It's not reacting. Oh, now it's reacting again. Great. And it's doing this in 5 different dimensions. As a consequence, a conversation was created. A conversation between the machine and the human. 1950s. Double loop. This is a machine where a student and a teacher were simulated by the hardware. A machine talking to a machine. This is a control panel from it that's in my hallway. But look at what this knob is called. It's a knob on the machine that's called obstinacy. The student can be made more obstinate or less obstinate simply by turning a knob. Also, there's the idea of awareness, internal and external awareness. Here's my favorite knob. It's called obliviscence. I had to find a dictionary that had this word in it. Only an English dictionary would have it. Obliviscence means willful forgetfulness. Something that we've all seen in students, I'm sure. In 1968, at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London, was a massive exhibition of over 100 works, computer art, computer music, and some robotic things. And again, Gordon Pask had this exhibition. You'll see, it's a little difficult to see there, perhaps it's easier to see now. So the large, voluptuous figures are females, and the dangly ones in the middle are males. And the way Colloquy of Mobiles, that was the name of it, colloquium, conversation worked, is the male figures and the female figures would rotate on their axis. And a light from the male figure would shine and rotate and move around. And when the light from the male figure hit the female figure's mirror at just the right spot and reflected back to the male, get the metaphor? Then they would stop and they would interact with each other and they would make noises. And then after a while they'd be satisfied and they would get bored and then they would go back to rotating randomly. I'm reproducing this now at the College for Creative Studies in the Interaction Design Department. We're building a full-scale model of what happened in 1968. But the fun part is, we're not going to worry about reproducing the digital stuff, right? That would be a little crazy. It's hard to see, but in the background here are some electronics, huge things, very kludgy, often exploded. But we're going to reproduce it digitally. And what this allows us to do is to reprogram it. So we can program male, female figures, gender fluid figures, whatever we like, with whatever kinds of interactions we want, because we can do facial recognition, speech, AI in the cloud, all kinds of things, and the students are in the middle of considering how they might reprogram that then. But what's the point? The point is, from a cybernetic viewpoint, 50 years ago, you can imagine machines talking to machines, even back then. Here's a bit of Gordon. I don't know whether you'll be able to hear this. Is it coming through? Maybe not. Can you hear? No. Okay. We'll keep going. He wrote books that look like this. And in particular, he influenced a lab at MIT called the Architecture Machine Group, where the idea was you could have conversation theory applied to a person talking to a machine, a person talking through a machine, through a network, to another machine, to a person, or a machine talking through a network to a person. This influenced this lab wildly. This lab became the MIT Media Lab. He published in this book that Negroponte published, founder of the Architecture Machine Group and also founder of the MIT Media Lab. He wrote a paper, Gordon Pask did, called Aspects of Machine Intelligence. This is one of his scribbles. It's not a scribble, it's a theory. And the idea is that you can have a conversation across participants, and you can have levels in that conversation, and they're just feedback loops. So he took conversation into the realm of cybernetics in terms of feedback loops. Here's another one of his diagrams in which the left side is a human designer, and the right side is a machine having a conversation with a human about the goals, the desires and intentions, and the actions that might be taken. Deeply influential work. This is a version of a machine he had in his laboratory. This is a version of that machine that I just showed you, which became my PhD thesis. It's a story for another time. It's an AI workstation from the 1980s. Here's a version of it in a modern form. This was a software company I had called General Cybernetics, and this system is called Thought shuffler. So on the left side, you'll see keywords as if you're doing a search. And instead of just showing you a linear list of results, it actually shuffled the thoughts and reprioritized them depending on you clicking on and off on the left side. A conversational machine with text. This was an iOS version that we built that I won't have time for. This was a version I showed to Condé Nast and other clients in New York days. But what's the point? The point is that I'm an interaction designer, teaching interaction designers, and I'm looking at the history. And I'm saying I don't need the most modern technology. I can look back 50 and 60 years and see extraordinary examples of the applications of cybernetics with amazing results, with amazing concepts that can be inspiring today. So in the middle here you see Gordon Pask, above that Umberto Maturana, a few other names, going back to Wiener and Heinz von Forster. This is a social graph of cybernetics that my colleague Hugh Dubberly conceived and that we published. I have a few copies here, by the way, if you'd like to see them after the talk. And the interactions that took place across a wide swath of time and ideas is well worth contemplating. Do any of you know the name Stuart Brand? You should know the name Stuart Brand. He's an extraordinary influence across many domains. He influenced people such as you'll see here, Tim Berners-Lee in the upper corner, inventor of the World Wide Web. Other places, Kevin Kelly and Coor and Plunkett, who invented Wired magazine. And who's down in the lower right-hand side? The claim is, in this social graph, that cybernetics, through generations, has influenced the technology that we have today. It's a little-known piece of history. I want to tell you now the parable of Luigi's Pizza. Will someone help me? Will someone ask me where there's good pizza? Where's there good pizza? Luigi's right across the street. Go there. Now, would you ask me why is it good pizza? Screw you. I'm not going to tell you why it's good. Now, I just described Google. Because Google doesn't tell you why it makes the decisions it makes. So I'm here to propose that conversation is the minimal ethical interface where conversation means that reliably and transparently the interface, the software, the app, the screen, will tell you why it's taking the action it's taking and what its intention is, the what and why across the interface. This is my axiom number one for interaction. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be transparent and give you 20 pages of the terms and conditions or 20 pages of the privacy policy, for example, right? This may be ethical, it's revealing it to you, but it's not telling you in a way that is humane. So my claim is that conversation is also the minimal humane interface because you can ask and answer specific questions in individual ways rather than be subject to a vast array of content that is too inhumane to go through. And as a consequence of conversation, trust and collaboration may arise. So why am I so interested in conversation, and why do I think cybernetics is so important to conversation? For these reasons. It's the foundation for these things. By the way, Kubernetes, the root of cybernetics, is a word that when it enters Latin becomes government. So government is also an attempt to regulate systems, in this case social systems. This is the final volley. This is my final piece of this. Thank you for your patience. Gordon Pask also has a theory of consciousness. You really can't talk about AI and robotics and cybernetics until you talk about consciousness, right? It'd be disappointing. I don't want to disappoint you. So the idea here is that someone knows a concept, T, P, and Q. So it might be a circle and a compass can be made on a piece of paper, and circle, compass, plane all goes together. Well, what Pask did is he turned this into a set of equations, cognitive equations, if you will, that are necessary as part of your understanding of what the concept is. So this is knowing that circle, compass, and plane go together. That's the left side. The right side is someone else has a different concept of circle. They think of a circle as taking a cylinder and slicing it. So they make circle differently. Now, you want to have these two people have a conversation such that they can understand each other perfectly. Not perfectly, I just made that up. so they can understand each other sufficiently well to keep talking? How does understanding arise? How is it that we talk to one another and in the end we get it and we have something in common that we can go forward with? That's an equation or a set of equations that looks like this. This is a process synchronization to go from two people thinking they think the same thing and verifying that they think the same thing, such that afterwards they both have both ideas. That's this diagram. And in the end, both have two different ways of deriving this idea of a circle. So again, you can't talk about cybernetics without something about conversation and consciousness. AI is not cybernetics. I invite you to examine this another time. What is this AI thing? Are we going to have robots everywhere? Or are we going to have sensitive machines that talk sensitively to other machines through cybernetic means? And that proposal would look like this. The most ethical thing we can do is to increase the choices of others. And through conversation, one can increase the choices of others. And through applying cybernetics and conversation to the machines that we build, we can have more ethical machines. This is called the ethical imperative, again, from Heinz von Forster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. There's one thing that came up that I found while we were just on break that I thought was really important that I'd like to read. And it goes back into choices and satisfaction. And Barry Schwartz is talking about when there's hundreds of different styles of jeans available and you buy one that's disappointing and you ask, who's responsible? It's clear that to yourself, you could have done better. With 100 different kinds of jeans on display, there's no excuse for failure. And so when people make decisions, and even though the results of the decisions are good, they still feel disappointed by them and blame themselves. Clinical depression has exploded in the industrial world in the last generation. I believe it's significant, and a significant contributor to this explosion of depression and also suicide is that people have experiences that are disappointing because their standards are so high. And then when they have to explain these experiences to themselves, they get very low.
And then she told me that her granddaughter... John, are you listening to me?
Of course I am, Mom.
Well, then why are you on your phone, ignoring your poor mother who only loves you and wants to spend time with you?
I was doing some banking on the Wells Fargo mobile app and I got carried away. Pay your bills? Done. Check your balances? Done. Deposit checks? Done. Even send and receive money? Are you updating your status right now?
With the Wells Fargo mobile app, it's easy to get banking done. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getbankingdone. Wells